Christmas tree is often seen as a symbol of warmth and tradition, but for some, it hides something far more sinister.
It was a cold December evening when the Wright family moved into their new home, a charming two-story house nestled on the outskirts of a small town. The house had a timeless feel, complete with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that seemed to whisper with every gust of wind. To make their first Christmas special, they decided to decorate the house with the usual festive cheer. A big Christmas tree in the living room, twinkling lights on the windows, and the scent of gingerbread baking in the oven. As the evening wore on, the tree was adorned with sparkling ornaments, each one representing a different memory. The family was excited, as it was their first Christmas in the new house. But even as they set the tree up, an odd sensation lingered in the air. It was as though the house, though cozy, wasn't quite as welcoming as it seemed. The first sign came when the father, Michael Wright, reached up to hang a star atop the tree. As his hand grazed the branches, he felt a cold chill wash over him, despite the warm glow from the fireplace. He brushed it off, assuming it was just the draft from the old house's cracked windows. But then, his son, Jake, noticed something strange. An old-fashioned ornament that seemed out of place among the modern decorations. It was a delicate porcelain angel, about 4 inches tall, with worn paint and cracks running across its face. It wasn't something the family had picked out, and no one remembered bringing it into the house. The angel's porcelain face seemed to shimmer in the light, and there was something unnerving about its hollow eyes. Without thinking too much of it, Michael placed the ornament on the tree alongside the other decorations. That night, as the family sat down to enjoy their first holiday dinner in the new home, the unease began to grow. The house was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. The wind had died down outside, and the usual hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the air. After dinner, the family settled in front of the tree to open their gifts, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Jake, who was about 8 years old, kept glancing nervously at the tree, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were seeing something they weren't. At bedtime, the family went to sleep, and everything seemed normal. But that's when things took a darker turn. Around 3 a.m., Michael was jolted awake by a sound. Something soft, almost like a whisper. He opened his eyes and sat up in bed, confused. The house was still, the only noise coming from the wind outside. But there was something different. He felt an odd pull to the living room. When he stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway, a strange chill filled the air. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the house felt eerily silent. As he made his way to the living room, Michael froze in his tracks. There, standing in front of the tree, was a shadowy figure. It was tall, slender, and unnaturally still. The figure was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, but its face was hidden in shadow. Michael tried to call out, but no words came. It was as though the air itself was thick with an oppressive weight that smothered sound. The figure didn't move, but Michael felt as though it was watching him, studying him. With a shiver running down his spine, Michael turned to run back to the bedroom. But as he did, the shadowy figure seemed to vanish, dissolving into the air like smoke. He rushed back to his room, his heart pounding, and lay there awake, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the house. The next morning, Michael brushed it off as a bad dream or a trick of his mind. But when he stepped into the living room, his heart sank. The angel ornament, which had been placed on the tree the night before, was now lying on the floor beneath the tree, face up. Michael couldn't explain how it got there, as the tree had been perfectly intact when they went to bed. For the next few nights, the strange occurrences escalated. Jake claimed to see the figure standing by the tree, watching them with its shadowed eyes, though no one else could see it. And every time the family would go to sleep, they would wake up to find the angel ornament moved again, always face up on the floor, as though placed there deliberately. Eventually, the family couldn't ignore the strange presence any longer. The eerie feeling surrounding the tree grew stronger, and Michael began to worry that something was haunting their new home. They decided to consult a local historian, who revealed that the house had once belonged to a wealthy family from the late 1800s. The previous owners were rumored to have had tragic deaths, and some believed the spirits of that family still lingered in the house, bound to the land. The angel ornament, it seemed, had once belonged to the previous family and was cursed. They were told that every Christmas, the spirit of the original owner would return to haunt anyone who dared place the ornament on their tree. The Wrights, feeling the weight of the warning, quickly packed their things and moved out of the house, leaving behind the Christmas tree and the porcelain angel. The Thompson family had always loved Christmas. It was a time of tradition, joy, and family bonding. So, when they moved into a new home in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, they were eager to make this Christmas extra special. The house itself was beautiful. An old, two-story Victorian with ornate woodwork and large windows that let in the soft winter light. It was perfect for decorating, and the family wasted no time setting up their Christmas tree in the grand living room. They had picked out a beautiful, full pine tree from the local lot. The smell of fresh pine filled the air as they carefully hung ornaments, draped the tinsel, and strung the lights. But it wasn't until they placed the final decoration, a delicate, vintage-looking ornament, that things started to feel off. The ornament was a simple wooden angel, painted in faded gold and red, its features worn by time. It was small, no more than 3 inches tall, and had an old-world charm about it. The Thompsons didn't remember where they had gotten it, but it felt like the perfect addition to their tree. It wasn't until after they had placed the angel on the highest bough that things began to take a dark turn. That night, as the family gathered around the tree to admire their handiwork, a sudden flicker of the lights caught their attention. The twinkling bulbs blinked in and out, and then, to their horror, they went completely dark. The family stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what was happening. But before anyone could say a word, the lights flickered back on. Only this time, they weren't the same. The once soft glow had turned a cold, ghostly blue, casting strange shadows across the room. The family glanced at each other, unsure of what they were seeing. But the strangest part was the angel ornament. It was no longer sitting gracefully atop the tree. It was gone. Panic set in. They checked the tree and the surrounding area, but the angel was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the next morning that they found the angel in the strangest of places. It was lying on the floor beneath the tree, face up, the wooden angel's gaze fixed toward the ceiling. It was as if someone had placed it there deliberately. The family thought it was strange, but they didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe the ornament had simply fallen off the tree, they reasoned. So, they put it back on the tree and tried to forget about it. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few nights, more and more strange things began to happen. The lights on the tree would flicker on and off, never in the same pattern, and the temperature in the room would suddenly drop, making everyone uncomfortable. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural chill. But it wasn't just the lights or the cold that unnerved them. The angel ornament, no matter where it was placed, would always end up on the floor beneath the tree, face up, as though it were staring at the family in some kind of accusatory silence. And then the noises began. Late at night, when the house was still and everyone was asleep, the family would hear the faint sound of a bell jingling. At first, they thought it was the wind or perhaps the sound of a distant car. But the jingling would grow louder, as if someone was shaking a bell just outside their door. The noises always seemed to be centered around the Christmas tree. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the father, Henry, noticed something strange. The angel ornament was once again on the floor beneath the tree, but this time, it was different. It wasn't simply lying there. It was positioned upright, as though placed by invisible hands, its cracked face turned towards the family, almost as if it were observing them. A cold, overwhelming dread filled the room, and for the first time, Henry felt truly scared. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. The family began to argue more, feeling the weight of something dark pressing down on them. The children couldn't sleep, and the air seemed thick with the sound of whispers. Whispers they couldn't quite make out, but that sounded far too familiar. It was as though someone was speaking right next to them. But when they turned around, no one was there. Desperate for answers, the Thompsons visited the local antique store to inquire about the origins of the ornament. The store owner, an elderly woman with a knowing look in her eyes, immediately recognized it. She took a step back and whispered, "That ornament. It belonged to someone who died tragically on Christmas Eve." Her name was Margaret Bennett. Margaret, the woman explained, had been the daughter of the original owners of the house, and she had passed away many years ago in a terrible accident, a tragic fire that claimed her life one cold winter's night. It was said that her spirit had never left the house, and that every year on Christmas Eve, she would return, seeking out the ornament that had once hung on her family's tree. The woman told the Thompsons that Margaret's spirit had become attached to the ornament, and anyone who placed it on their tree would be cursed. The whispers, the cold spots, the shifting lights, they were all signs of her restless spirit trying to communicate. Margaret's ghost was trapped, and the ornament was the key to her torment. That was the last straw for the Thompsons. In a fit of panic, they removed the ornament from the tree and burned it, hoping to rid themselves of the curse. But even as the flames consumed the little angel, they couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's presence was still in the house. The strange occurrences slowly stopped, but the family never truly felt at peace again. They moved out shortly after, leaving the house behind, but every year, on Christmas Eve, they would hear the sound of jingling bells in the distance, a haunting reminder of the cursed ornament that once hung on their tree. It was a cold winter's night when the Carter family moved into their new home. The house was old, dating back to the early 1900s, with a history steeped in mystery. The previous owners had lived there for decades before passing on, and the house had stood empty for a while. When the Carters purchased the house, they were enchanted by its charm. The tall windows, the intricate woodwork, and the spacious rooms that seemed perfect for their growing family. However, there was something unsettling about the house, something the family couldn't quite put their finger on. As Christmas approached, the family decided to make their first holiday in the new home memorable. They put up a large tree in the living room, draped in white lights, ornaments, and tinsel. It was a tradition for them to decorate the tree together, and they spent hours arranging the ornaments, some of which had been passed down through generations. The fireplace crackled nearby, and the smell of fresh pine filled the room. But as soon as the tree was finished, the air in the house shifted. There was a weight to it now, an oppressive presence that seemed to settle over the family like a dark cloud. The Carters attributed it to the stress of moving and adjusting to their new home. After all, it was their first Christmas in a new place, and the excitement of the season should have been enough to overshadow any strange feelings. That night, as the family gathered around the tree to enjoy some cocoa and exchange gifts, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly uncomfortable. The temperature in the living room seemed to drop inexplicably. The warmth of the fire was suddenly not enough to stave off a cold chill that swept through the room. As they sat together, one of the children, Emily, pointed at the tree and whispered, "Mom, look at the shadow on the wall." Everyone turned to see what she was referring to. At first glance, it appeared as though the shadow of the tree's branches stretched out across the wall. But something about it seemed off. The shape of the shadow was unusually distorted, twisted into a figure that didn't match the tree's natural form. It looked like a person, tall and hunched, with long, spindly limbs that reached out like fingers. The family tried to brush it off as a trick of the light or the reflection of the fire, but as the evening wore on, the shadow remained unchanging. It didn't flicker or shift with the movement of the branches. It was as if it was watching them, staying frozen in place. A strange feeling of dread began to creep in, and the Carters found themselves growing increasingly uneasy as they sat in the dimly lit room. That night, they went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, echoing through the silence of the night. Around 2 a.m., John Carter woke up to an odd noise. It sounded like something scratching against the walls, faint but persistent. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling. But then he heard something even more unsettling: footsteps. Not the usual creaks of an old house, but the distinct sound of footsteps pacing back and forth near the living room. John sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at his wife, Sarah, who was still fast asleep, unaware of the sounds. His curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to get up and investigate. He crept out of bed and made his way to the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. When he reached the living room, he froze. Standing next to the tree was a dark figure, its shape cloaked in shadow. It was tall, thin, and standing unnaturally still. John's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure had no discernible features, just a silhouette that seemed to blend into the darkness of the room. For a moment, John thought he was imagining things, but then the figure began to move. It stepped toward the tree, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, as if it were gliding rather than walking. It reached out with long, bony fingers toward the branches, as if inspecting the ornaments. John was frozen in place, unable to speak or make a sound. In an instant, the figure turned and locked eyes with him. It was as if it could see him, even though its face was hidden in the dark. A wave of terror washed over John as he realized this wasn't a dream. It was real. He tried to move, to call out, but his body wouldn't respond. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. The shadowy figure slowly faded into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there. When John finally regained control of his body, he rushed back to his room, his heart racing. He woke Sarah, telling her about what he had seen, but she just looked at him, confused and concerned. She hadn't heard any footsteps or seen anything strange. The next day, John and Sarah decided to investigate the history of the house. They visited the local library and found out that the land on which their house stood had once been the site of an old graveyard. The original owners had lived there for over a century, but after several mysterious deaths and strange occurrences, they had abandoned the house. The land was never properly cleared, and many of the graves were left untouched. The most disturbing part of the story was that the original owner's son had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. Some believed he had been buried beneath the tree itself, or at least near it. As it turned out, the strange figure John had seen was likely the restless spirit of the young man, forever bound to the house and the tree. That night, they decided to take action. They moved the tree out of the living room, burning the wooden ornament that had been placed on top as a final act of closure. The house was still, the air lighter, and for the first time since moving in, the Carters felt a sense of peace. But even after they moved out of the house, every Christmas they would hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls in the back of their minds, a chilling reminder of the shadow in the tree that had watched them.